So, I want you to picture this. It's 1839, and a young Princess Alexandrina Victoria has just ascended the throne 2 years prior, with the death of her uncle William IV. And this Princess Alexandrina Victoria is better known as Queen Victoria, who of course was the monarch who reigned over the British Empire in the 19th century. But at this time here, in the beginning of her reign, her empire, although it was quite large, it was nowhere near as vast as it would become by the end of her reign almost 60 years later. So as you can see on the map here, they didn't have control over much of India yet, didn't have much control over much of Africa, nor did they actually have much control over either the Australian interior or the Canadian interior. So as you can see, it's huge, but it's nowhere near as huge as it would later be. So in 1839, this is where this young queen, she is basically looking for suitors, and she invites a 21-year-old man to stay at her palace. And in the course of those 3 days, the two of them fell madly in love. But unfortunately, the marriage was not to be, and, as they say, the rest is history. But who was this young man? Who was this young 21-year-old? Well, he was none other than Tsarevich Alexander, who would later become Alexander II, and he was the heir to the Russian throne. So, of course, the two of them would never have actually been able to marry, mainly because A, he's Orthodox, B, she's Protestant, and the most important thing of all is the fact that he is not the heir to a minor throne. Instead, he is the heir to one of Britain's greatest rivals. And as a result, this just would never do. And so the two of them didn't end up getting married, and instead in the next year, in 1840, this is where Victoria ended up marrying Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg, and in 1841, Alexander would end up marrying Marie of Hesse. And so, of course, this marriage never ended up taking place, but we're going to imagine, for argument's sake, what would have happened if these smitten people, these people who are deeply in love, what if love had triumphed all and they had actually got married? That's what we're going to explore in the course of this video. So we should say that actually the British throne, it's not the first time that they had a personal union. First of all, in terms of there being a personal union between England and Scotland with the ascendancy of the Stuart dynasty. So we've covered that in our video on the Stuarts. Definitely go and check that video out. But also, after the Stuart dynasty came the Hanoverian dynasty. And this is where you had what we call George I, and he ascended to the British throne. And so every monarch in Britain from 1714 to 1837 was also the head of Hanover. However, Salic law determined that no female could become the head of the Hanoverian throne, and so as a result of that, in 1837, there ended up being the ending of this personal union between Great Britain and Hanover. But we should say that just because the two of them had this personal union, it didn't mean that they were politically combined. They both had separate parliaments, they both were basically run along completely separate lines. And so just because, in this case here that we're imagining, Queen Victoria ends up marrying, the heir apparent of the Russian throne, it doesn't mean that Great Britain and the Russian Empire are going to merge together. And actually, we should say that Britain during this time, they actually defended Hanover whenever Hanover was attacked by different powers. And so that's something to kind of bear in mind, that if there was this personal union, Britain would come to the aid of Russia, hypothetically, or at bare minimum would not interfere with Russia's geopolitical interest. And so that's kind of the basis of what we're going to be looking at here. And we should note also the longevity of this union would have been incredibly limited. So in the case of Hanover, as soon as the personal union was over, Britain no longer cared about Hanoverian interests. And so we can see this most clearly in 1866 when you had the Austro-Prussian War. So Hanover had been an ally of the Austrians, and so as punishment for this, the Prussians took over Hanover, and this ended the independent state of Hanover. And Britain didn't really care. Even Queen Victoria herself doesn't seem to have really cared. So you can see that in terms of the longevity of this personal union, it literally would just be contained to the marriage of the two monarchs. So in the hypothetical case here, we're only looking from 1839 to 1881, And this is because in 1881, Alexander II was killed in a terrorist attack. So we've covered this more in our video on what if the Russian Revolution never happened. Definitely go and check that video out. So this is basically a period of a few decades where Britain's and Russia's relationship might have been a little bit better than it otherwise would. And so that's what we're going to explore in terms of how would this have actually affected the history of the 19th century. Well, the first thing I have to say is that the Crimean War, which is another video which we've already done, definitely go and check that video out as well. The Crimean War in this scenario still would have happened. Hate to burst anyone's bubble, but it still would happen. And the reason is because Alexander II didn't ascend the throne until 1855, and the Crimean War began in 1854. So at best, you could say maybe the war ends a little bit earlier than it otherwise would. Maybe Britain pulls out of it, but actually if you look at the number of troops that were sent into the Crimea, it was actually predominantly the French. The British only sent a small contingent. And so, you know, maybe the war ends a little bit sooner, but it's unlikely it would have had much of a huge ramification. And actually, I think the main thing it would have been is just a mild embarrassment that, you know, you're fighting the Tsar of Russia and he's married to the Queen of England. So I think that kind of would have been it. But what we can say is that actually, even if the war had kind of continued, I think that once the war had concluded, relationships would have been better patched up than they were within our own timeline. And so this would have had effects throughout the next few decades, because this is where Britain and Russia end up entering the Great Game. So the Great Game is a term about the geopolitical struggles between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, especially within Central Asia. So in 1855, the Russian Empire only basically extended in Central Asia to what is modern-day Kazakhstan, and all of the places below it, so if you think about like Uzbekistan and other places like that, these places here were not yet part of the Russian Empire. And similarly, Britain was coming up through India and hadn't yet reached the Afghan border, and yet, bit by bit, the two empires came closer and closer together, and this is where you're having lots of tension throughout Afghanistan and the surrounding regions. So, Alexander II is the one who expanded the Russian Empire, and as a result, this is why the British end up being very worried about Russian expansion. However, in a scenario here where Queen Victoria is married to the Tsar, maybe, just maybe, the Tsar holds back off of his expansion into Central Asia, and they continue to have these other states such as Khiva and Bukhara as basically buffer states between them and the British. And so, British and Russian relations during the 19th century would have been better than they otherwise were. Now, it's not to say that this would have had much longevity. Equally, as soon as he died in 1881, Russia might still have expanded. Although, it should be noted that in this scenario here, Alexander II's son would actually have been the same son of Queen Victoria. So that's something to kind of bear in mind, that actually, the new Tsar would be half English, and so maybe their relations, again, would be relatively good. So it's a very interesting scenario that we have to kind of look at here, but I don't think it has much strength to it. And the reason being is because